I burned the wedding invitations before they ever left the printer's box. Watching the white cardstock curl and blacken under the flame was the first time in years that I felt powerful, like the pain they carved into me could finally cut both ways. My family believed I was too weak, too pitiful, too invisible to strike back. But when they told me I didn't deserve a seat at the one day I had spent my entire life sacrificing for, something inside me snapped. I realized I had given them everything, my youth, my paycheck, my loyalty, and they decided my only reward was exile. That night, standing alone in my dim apartment kitchen, I whispered to the flames, "If I am not welcome, then no one will celebrate." That was the night I decided there would be no wedding to attend. My name is Marissa Caldwell, and I am 37 years old. I grew up in a small Ohio town where family meant everything. Or so I thought. I was the eldest daughter of proud, church-going parents who held tradition above all else. My younger brother, Daniel, was their golden boy, the football hero in high school, the college graduate, the first one to get engaged. I was the daughter who stayed behind, working 2 jobs to help with my father's medical bills, putting my own dreams on hold while Daniel chased his. I never complained, never asked for thanks, because I believed love was supposed to be unconditional. But the truth, my sacrifices were invisible until they became convenient to mock. I can still hear my mother's voice when she said it, sharp and dismissive over the phone. "Marissa, on your brother's wedding day, it's better if you're not there. People will talk. You'll ruin the pictures." The words sank into my chest like knives, each syllable reminding me that my worth in their eyes had shriveled into nothing. My crime? Being single, divorced, childless. A woman with scars from battles they never acknowledged. My ex-husband left me after draining my savings, and I never recovered financially. To them, I was an embarrassment, and instead of offering me a seat at the table, they shoved me out the door and locked it. When I hung up the phone that night, I didn't cry. I thought I would, but no tears came. Instead, I stood in silence and looked around my empty apartment. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, the air heavy with loneliness. Years of bending myself into shapes for their approval had left me hollow. I thought about the overtime shifts I pulled to cover Dad's prescriptions, the vacations I skipped so Daniel could afford his car, the way I pawned my grandmother's necklace to keep the lights on when the house payments fell short. None of it mattered. None of it counted. And that's when something inside me hardened like concrete. I wouldn't beg them for scraps of love anymore. The next morning, I drove past the Caldwell family home, the place I had once scrubbed and painted and filled with laughter. It looked like a postcard. The white porch swing, the flower boxes, the smell of my mother's apple pie drifting from the open window. But I didn't stop. I parked across the street, watching from behind the steering wheel as Daniel and his fiancée, bright and glowing, carried boxes of decorations inside. Streamers, flowers, fairy lights, all the symbols of a joy I was not allowed to share. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't jealous of their love. I was furious at their cruelty, their smug dismissal of the daughter who had kept them afloat when storms nearly drowned them. My coworkers would describe me as kind, dependable, always the one who stayed late to finish what others left undone. But no one outside those office walls knew the weight I carried home each night. They didn't know about the unpaid credit cards, the student loans still haunting me from a degree I never finished, the hollow ache of being forgotten at family dinners. I was the sister who never made the photo albums, the daughter who could vanish without a trace. When I thought about that wedding, with its sparkling chandeliers and endless champagne, I saw myself erased in real time. They had chosen to celebrate my brother's future by erasing my existence. And I refused to let that stand. It started as a whisper in my mind. You could stop this. You could take it all away. At first, I pushed it aside, telling myself I wasn't that kind of person. But the more I replayed my mother's words, the louder the whisper grew. I remembered every insult, every dismissal, every time they made me the family's punchline. I remembered standing in the rain outside the courthouse during my divorce, dialing home for comfort, only to hear my father say, "Maybe if you'd been a better wife, he would have stayed." That memory made my chest tighten until breathing hurt, and in that pain, the whisper turned into a vow. I started gathering information without even realizing it. The wedding venue, the catering company, the florist, all the pieces of their dream celebration became lines on a notepad I tucked into my desk drawer. At first, I told myself it was curiosity, maybe even a way to torture myself by imagining what I'd miss. But late at night, when I stared at the notepad, I felt something different. Control. For once in my life, I held the strings. They thought they could cast me aside like trash. But what happens when the trash decides to set fire to the banquet hall? One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped by a liquor store and bought the cheapest bottle of wine. I sat on the floor of my apartment, sipping from the neck, staring at the notepad with a trembling hand. The question burned inside me. How far am I willing to go? I pictured Daniel's fiancée walking down the aisle, my parents beaming with pride, the applause echoing through the hall. And then I pictured silence, an empty venue, a canceled ceremony, humiliation replacing joy. The thought filled me with a dark satisfaction I had never known before. For the first time, I felt like I could rewrite the script they had forced me to play. I know what you're thinking. Revenge is ugly. Maybe it is. But tell me, what choice did I have? After 37 years of servitude, of swallowing my pride and living in the shadows, they had shown me what I truly meant to them, nothing. So I decided I would give them nothing in return. No wedding, no celebration, no golden boy's perfect day. If I was unworthy of love, then they were unworthy of happiness. And as I made that decision, I felt a dangerous calm settle over me, like the eye of a storm before the destruction begins. I burned the wedding invitations before they ever left the printer's box. Watching the white cardstock curl and blacken under the flame was the first time in years that I felt powerful, like the pain they carved into me could finally cut both ways. My family believed I was too weak, too pitiful, too invisible to strike back. But when they told me I didn't deserve a seat at the one day I had spent my entire life sacrificing for, something inside me snapped. I realized I had given them everything, my youth, my paycheck, my loyalty, and they decided my only reward was exile. That night, standing alone in my dim apartment kitchen, I whispered to the flames, "If I am not welcome, then no one will celebrate." That was the night I decided there would be no wedding to attend. My name is Marissa Caldwell, and I am 37 years old. I grew up in a small Ohio town where family meant everything. Or so I thought. I was the eldest daughter of proud, church-going parents who held tradition above all else. My younger brother, Daniel, was their golden boy, the football hero in high school, the college graduate, the first one to get engaged. I was the daughter who stayed behind, working 2 jobs to help with my father's medical bills, putting my own dreams on hold while Daniel chased his. I never complained, never asked for thanks, because I believed love was supposed to be unconditional. But the truth, my sacrifices were invisible until they became convenient to mock. I can still hear my mother's voice when she said it, sharp and dismissive over the phone. "Marissa, on your brother's wedding day, it's better if you're not there. People will talk. You'll ruin the pictures." The words sank into my chest like knives, each syllable reminding me that my worth in their eyes had shriveled into nothing. My crime? Being single, divorced, childless. A woman with scars from battles they never acknowledged. My ex-husband left me after draining my savings, and I never recovered financially. To them, I was an embarrassment, and instead of offering me a seat at the table, they shoved me out the door and locked it. When I hung up the phone that night, I didn't cry. I thought I would, but no tears came. Instead, I stood in silence and looked around my empty apartment. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, the air heavy with loneliness. Years of bending myself into shapes for their approval had left me hollow. I thought about the overtime shifts I pulled to cover Dad's prescriptions, the vacations I skipped so Daniel could afford his car, the way I pawned my grandmother's necklace to keep the lights on when the house payments fell short. None of it mattered. None of it counted. And that's when something inside me hardened like concrete. I wouldn't beg them for scraps of love anymore. The next morning, I drove past the Caldwell family home, the place I had once scrubbed and painted and filled with laughter. It looked like a postcard. The white porch swing, the flower boxes, the smell of my mother's apple pie drifting from the open window. But I didn't stop. I parked across the street, watching from behind the steering wheel as Daniel and his fiancée, bright and glowing, carried boxes of decorations inside. Streamers, flowers, fairy lights, all the symbols of a joy I was not allowed to share. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't jealous of their love. I was furious at their cruelty, their smug dismissal of the daughter who had kept them afloat when storms nearly drowned them. My coworkers would describe me as kind, dependable, always the one who stayed late to finish what others left undone. But no one outside those office walls knew the weight I carried home each night. They didn't know about the unpaid credit cards, the student loans still haunting me from a degree I never finished, the hollow ache of being forgotten at family dinners. I was the sister who never made the photo albums, the daughter who could vanish without a trace. When I thought about that wedding, with its sparkling chandeliers and endless champagne, I saw myself erased in real time. They had chosen to celebrate my brother's future by erasing my existence. And I refused to let that stand. It started as a whisper in my mind. You could stop this. You could take it all away. At first, I pushed it aside, telling myself I wasn't that kind of person. But the more I replayed my mother's words, the louder the whisper grew. I remembered every insult, every dismissal, every time they made me the family's punchline. I remembered standing in the rain outside the courthouse during my divorce, dialing home for comfort, only to hear my father say, "Maybe if you'd been a better wife, he would have stayed." That memory made my chest tighten until breathing hurt, and in that pain, the whisper turned into a vow. I started gathering information without even realizing it. The wedding venue, the catering company, the florist, all the pieces of their dream celebration became lines on a notepad I tucked into my desk drawer. At first, I told myself it was curiosity, maybe even a way to torture myself by imagining what I'd miss. But late at night, when I stared at the notepad, I felt something different. Control. For once in my life, I held the strings. They thought they could cast me aside like trash. But what happens when the trash decides to set fire to the banquet hall? One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped by a liquor store and bought the cheapest bottle of wine. I sat on the floor of my apartment, sipping from the neck, staring at the notepad with a trembling hand. The question burned inside me. How far am I willing to go? I pictured Daniel's fiancée walking down the aisle, my parents beaming with pride, the applause echoing through the hall. And then I pictured silence, an empty venue, a canceled ceremony, humiliation replacing joy. The thought filled me with a dark satisfaction I had never known before. For the first time, I felt like I could rewrite the script they had forced me to play. I know what you're thinking. Revenge is ugly. Maybe it is. But tell me, what choice did I have? After 37 years of servitude, of swallowing my pride and living in the shadows, they had shown me what I truly meant to them, nothing. So I decided I would give them nothing in return. No wedding, no celebration, no golden boy's perfect day. If I was unworthy of love, then they were unworthy of happiness. And as I made that decision, I felt a dangerous calm settle over me, like the eye of a storm before the destruction begins. The final decision came to me like lightning striking without warning. As I lay in bed, staring at the notepad on my nightstand, I realized there was no going back. The plan wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was real, alive, demanding to be executed. My family wanted me erased, but before they could erase me, I would erase the very day they worshipped. I would burn their golden memory before it ever had a chance to shine. The only question left was how. And then, one late night, I stumbled across something that made the decision for me. Something so shocking, so dangerous, that it changed everything I thought I knew about Daniel, Harper, and the wedding itself. I had been scrolling through Harper's public social media late one night, glass of wine in hand, when I stumbled across a private event page accidentally linked to her bio. My heart raced as I clicked, not expecting it to open, but it did. The page revealed behind-the-scenes posts for the bridal party, timelines, notes, private chats, even vendor discussions. I scrolled faster, my hands trembling. Then I saw it, a thread of Harper and Daniel mocking me, calling me dead weight, the bitter sister, and joking that I would ruin their pictures. My chest tightened like a vice. But the worst part was a photo of my parents, smiling proudly, captioned, "Finally, a real Caldwell wedding without the baggage." They weren't just excluding me, they were celebrating my absence. That realization snapped something inside me. I wasn't dealing with ignorance anymore. I was dealing with deliberate cruelty. As I kept scrolling, one post stood out from the rest. It was a message Harper had sent to the bridesmaids, laughing about how easy it was to cut me off because Marissa never fights back anyway. The words burned into my brain, ringing like a dare. I read them again and again, my pulse quickening with every repetition. Never fights back. That was what they thought of me. That I would curl up, accept the scraps, stay silent like I always had. Rage surged through me, hotter than fire. If they believed I wouldn't fight back, then it was time to prove them wrong in a way they'd never forget. Their wedding wasn't just fragile, it was a house of cards. And with one push, I could bring it crashing down. The next morning, I felt a strange calm as I dressed for work. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it had crystallized into something sharper. Focus. I was done being their victim. I carried that clarity into every step I took, every thought I had. At work, I appeared as normal as ever, but in my mind, I was piecing together the next phase. I knew where the florist was delivering when the caterer's trucks would arrive, and how the rehearsal dinner was scheduled. But it wasn't enough just to sabotage details. No, they deserved humiliation. They deserved to have their perfect day torn apart in front of everyone they'd tried to impress. And I knew exactly how to do it. I began by creating a fake email account under Harper's name. It was surprisingly easy, just a tweak of her real one, barely noticeable at first glance. Using this, I contacted the caterer with last-minute changes, asking them to swap the custom entrees for cheaper alternatives. I also sent a message to the photographer, demanding rescheduling and threatening non-payment. Within hours, confusion spread like wildfire among the vendors. I sat at my desk, pretending to type spreadsheets, while in reality, I was watching their perfect day unravel thread by thread. Every email I sent, every lie I crafted, filled me with a sense of justice. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was art. But the true weapon wasn't in logistics. It was in secrets. On that bridal party page, I'd uncovered something more explosive than any vendor chaos. Buried deep in the chats was a conversation between Harper and her maid of honor about Daniel's recent fling. They laughed about how he had been so sloppy hiding it, and how Harper planned to use it against him if their marriage ever soured. My stomach lurched as I read the details, shock giving way to exhilaration. This wasn't just ammunition, it was a bomb waiting to go off. And I knew exactly when to detonate it. If my family wanted a perfect wedding, then I would make sure that perfect wedding became the stage for their disgrace. I printed the screenshots, tucking them into a manila envelope. Just holding them felt electric, like gripping lightning in my hands. For years, I had been silent while they made me invisible, but now I had the power to expose their golden boy as a fraud in front of everyone. The thought of my parents' faces, my mother's smug pride collapsing into horror, my father's arrogance dissolving into shame, gave me strength. This wasn't petty revenge anymore. This was justice for every time they ignored me, belittled me, erased me. I would show the world the truth, and I would do it on the very day they thought they had erased me for good. Still, part of me hesitated. Sitting alone in my apartment that night, the envelope on the table, I wondered if I was crossing a line too dark to return from. But then I remembered Daniel's voice on the phone, cold and dismissive. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He hadn't cared about me. None of them had. I poured myself another glass of wine, staring at the envelope, and made a promise. No matter what, I would not back down. They wanted me erased, but I would write my name across their wedding day in fire. Whatever consequences followed, I would face them with no regret. Over the next week, I played my role perfectly. When co-workers asked about the wedding, I shrugged and said I wasn't involved, forcing a polite smile. No one suspected a thing. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, I rehearsed every step. I memorized the mansion layout, timed the deliveries, and crafted my entrance plan. I wasn't just crashing their wedding. I was orchestrating the downfall of their entire charade. The more I planned, the calmer I felt, as though this wasn't an act of revenge, but destiny itself. They had written me out of the script, but I was rewriting the ending, and my version would be unforgettable. The night before the wedding, I stood outside the mansion again, the gardens glowing under strings of lights. Inside, I could hear laughter and music from the rehearsal dinner. My chest ached, not from longing anymore, but from resolve. They thought they were celebrating the night before their perfect day. What they didn't know was that their destruction was already written, sealed in the envelope I carried. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, the Caldwell's world would come crashing down, and I would be the one pulling the strings. As I turned to leave, I whispered into the night, "You wanted me gone. Now, you'll wish I never existed." But as I walked back to my car, headlights flared in the distance, pulling into the gravel drive. I ducked behind a hedge, heart pounding, as the vehicle came closer. It wasn't a vendor or a guest. It was someone I recognized. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about their secrets and my plan took a dangerous new turn. I pressed my back against the hedges and tried to slow my breathing as the car idled a few yards away. Moonlight glinted off the chrome, and the garden sound seemed distant, like a radio turned down. For a foolish second, I hoped it was a vendor running an errand, not someone who knew the secret I clutched in my bag. The engine went quiet, and a laugh that used to be easy and bright filled the air. Tyler Monroe. He had been a constant in the background of my childhood, a smiling boy with a skateboard and a quick joke, the kind of person who made everything feel bearable. Seeing him now, years later and hollowed by life's small wars, made the plan in my bag feel heavier. I had rehearsed this night in the dark, over and over, imagining the gasp when I handed the envelope to my mother, imagining their faces cracking like cheap porcelain. Instead, Hearing Tyler's laugh made my pulse stutter, and I realized how little I had accounted for human history crashing into my neat revenge. He must have seen a movement, because his head turned sharply when his gaze slid to the hedge and then to my hiding spot. A slow, soft recognition passed over his face. He didn't yell. He didn't move fast. Instead, he walked quietly toward me, the weight of years between us forming a small space of awkwardness. I should have explained myself, fabricated a plausible errand, or simply fled, but the envelope in my bag felt too hot to hide. Tyler crouched beside me, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and the faint tang of smoke from his old cigarettes. He asked only one question at first, "Marissa?" And that name, when spoken, blew open old wounds. I realized then how much of my life had become a ledger. Insults recorded, slights tabulated, and a slow hunger for justice building in the margins. I tightened my grip on the paper as if it could keep me from collapsing. Tyler's voice was low, the same steady timbre that had steadied me through teenage storms. He asked questions, not accusations, which made me resent him for being gentle when everyone else had been sharp. I told him about Harper's posts, the mocking messages that turned private cruelty into public spectacle, the photograph with my parents, and that cruel caption that proved my place in their plan. I told him how vendors had been manipulated, how a photographer had received a threatening email, how I'd arranged for evidence to be collected quietly. As the words left my lips, a part of me surprised me. I found myself speaking with a clarity I hadn't allowed before. The story poured out like a dam relieved, each memory a brick removed. Tyler listened without interrupting, his jaw taut. When I finished, the silence felt like a verdict. He rubbed his forehead and asked, "Is this what you really want?" I swallowed. The answer I'd rehearsed sounded different when I had to say it aloud. Yes, but not just for spectacle. I wanted them to see me as I'd seen them. He studied the envelope then, his fingers hovering but not touching. He asked, "Have you thought about what happens after?" And I realized he was asking about wreckage, not the immediate satisfaction of revenge. Tyler had an instinct for consequence, a practical streak that came from nights on the road, learning the cost of impulsive choices. I told him I had thought about nothing else for months. The plan had become my pulse. He warned me about legal dangers, libel, impersonation of vendors, and the risk of being framed as the aggressor. He warned me about collateral damage, innocent people losing jobs, friendships burned, and a future where I would have to live with the choice I made. His words were not a call to abandon my aim, but a plea to temper it, to make the truth undeniable rather than to fling accusations that could be erased by lawyers and hashtags. I felt the brittle edges of my anger soften into something more deliberate, and for the first time since the first cruel post, a path forward felt possible instead of simply destructive. We sat on the cold stone steps for a long time, drinking coffee from a thermos Tyler produced as if it were a talisman, and the sky shifted from ink to pewter. Dawn brushed the mansion roof with pale light, and the garden around us woke in muted shades. Tyler told me about his years away, how small venues and late-night diners teach you patience, and how the music business chews up grand gestures. I told him about the small humiliations that had accumulated into an avalanche, birthdays forgotten, achievements ignored in family conversations, being the punchline at gatherings dressed up as jokes. It was small cruelties that make giants. I had become a catalog of those slights. He reached out and touched my hand, a gentle anchor, and said, "You deserve better than to become what they accuse you of being." In that touch, I felt both mercy and a steadying that I hadn't allowed myself to accept for years. Together, we revised the strategy. Instead of making baseless public claims that could be tossed aside or sued away, we focused on provable facts and smart exposure. Tyler suggested collecting witness statements from vendors who had felt pressured, preserving emails and receipts, and arranging for a lawyer to read everything with an eye for careful legal pressure. He pushed me to think like someone building a case rather than someone staging a spectacle, keep the moral high ground, avoid traps that would make me the villain, and build a narrative so solid even denials would crumble. I resisted at first. The old hunger for immediate retribution still burned, but then I saw how an orderly, honest reveal could not only expose Daniel's betrayal and my parents' social cruelty, but could also compel accountability without ending me. We mapped out who to contact, how to secure backups, and where to keep copies so nothing could disappear. When the wedding morning arrived, the air was tight with expectation, and the neighborhood hummed with delivery trucks and last-minute errands. Tyler drove me to a diner near the venue and sat with me while I sent final emails with a steady hand. Each message was precise, photographs attached, timelines annotated, and a clear, calm request for integrity from an independent journalist and a family law attorney. We added trail evidence, messages from vendors, copies of invoices, and a list of witnesses who could corroborate the pattern of intentional exclusion. It felt clinical and righteous. I copied the evidence into an encrypted folder and sent secure links to 2 trusted people outside the family orbit. Tyler watched my hands the way a conductor watches an orchestra. He didn't interfere, but his presence made me more disciplined, less theatrical. I breathed and felt oddly centered, as if setting truth in motion made me lighter than any private rage could. Small setbacks rattled me and tested my newly formed restraint. A bridesmaid walked past the alley where I waited and gave me a wary look that could have exposed everything. I improvised a story about being a florist assistant who'd misplaced a delivery form, and she frowned before moving on. Later, the caterer called asking about dessert finalization. I answered as if I were a coordinator, buying time and keeping the chaos at a manageable fever. Each little lie left a residue on me, a sticky moral film that tugged at my intent. I wanted to be clean in this. I wanted my actions to be transparent and honest, but necessity pushed small deceptions into play. Tyler kept reminding me of the plan's spine: evidence, witnesses, legal counsel. Every small improvisation felt like walking a tightrope, and I concentrated on breathing, on keeping the balance until the final move could be made clean. The rehearsal shimmered behind the tall windows of the mansion as guests laughed and rehearsed vows, and the scene looked like a postcard someone else had staged. Inside, people traded compliments and avoided certain arguments. Outside, the world moved like a hand over a diorama. My childhood memories of being served the smallest portions and buffered from the center of celebrations returned like a video loop, fueling the resolve in my chest. This was about more than the wedding. It was about the sum of silences and small erasures that had told me my place was always at the margin. I sent a quiet, factual note to the officiant and to the family attorney reiterating documented information and asking for a private conversation. I also asked the journalist to hold the story until we had given family members a chance to respond. I wanted accountability, not blood sport. The hour felt enormous and fragile at once. Then Daniel called. The sound of his voice, tight with panic and thinly veiled blame, made the last bits of composure slip. He mentioned chaos. The florist had swapped arrangements, deliveries had been confused, and vendors reported inconsistent confirmations. He asked where I was, and I lied and said I was out of town, hearing the false calm in my voice as if from under a sheet. Tyler's eyes narrowed, then softened, and he told me to keep to the plan. We drove to a vantage point across the street, where we could see the driveway and the first arrivals. Cars came in neat lines, guests in their best pretending not to wonder why something felt off. I watched my family move through the door looking radiant and oblivious, and the algebra of small insults and neglect suddenly added up to a monstrous figure in my mind. I counted to steady myself and prepared for what had to come. Night would come, and with it, choices that would change everything. Sitting beside Tyler, watching lights in the mansion flicker like distant stars, I felt a strange combination of fear and relief. The plan we'd shaped could expose hypocrisy, could force my parents and Daniel to face what they had hidden, but it could also break bonds beyond repair. Tyler squeezed my hand and said, "If you burn them today, you must be ready to live in the ashes." That image lodged in me, bright and terrifying. I understood then that my revenge could be righteous and ruinous at the same time. I promised myself that whatever unfolded, it would be grounded in truth and restraint. We stood, gathered our things, and walked toward the streetlight where the decision would be made, each step a drumbeat toward a moment when secrets would finally have to speak. I walked back down the driveway after the confrontation, feeling like someone had scraped my name off every plaque in the town. The night air tasted like wet pavement and promises I'd already broken. Tyler followed at my shoulder, steady and patient, like a metronome for chaos. People clustered on the porch in awkward groups, the journalists still jotting notes in a small leather book, vendors whispering with faces lit by their phone screens. My parents stood together in a fragile, shocked shell of dignity, and for the first time I saw them, as others did, not majestic or grand, but small, nervous people trying to hold together an image that had already been shredded. When the attorney finally arrived, he did not come to scold or to fix. He came with questions and an impressive calm that made the whole scene feel, suddenly, like evidence. He asked for copies of everything. I handed over the folder with hands that trembled, but did not let go. Tyler's hand brushed mine, and the shadow of his touch steadied me. After the attorney left, we sat in the car and let the engine hum fill the silence between us. Tyler suggested practical steps. Back up the files, send copies to trusted contacts, inform the vendors formally so they had documentation to protect themselves. Practicality soothed me in a way that righteous fury never had. It turned anger into something I could point to and manage. I did the tasks slowly, like a person making an altar, encrypting files, making receipts, gathering witness contact details. Each small action felt like putting down another brick on the path I had chosen. People would say later that I was dramatic or petty, but what I built that night was more than a spectacle. It was a fortress of facts. The journalist called to say she had a hard copy of the timeline and wanted to verify one minor detail, my memory of a date. And when I confirmed it, the click of agreement on the other end sounded like permission. The next day, the town was a different animal. Gossip travels faster than kindness here. By morning, the local bakery owner knew, and the barista at the coffee shop offered me a look that mixed sympathy with eager curiosity. My mother's name, once spoken like a bookmark in polite conversation, now carried an edge. People who had smiled at her at Sunday market seemed to shift their gaze. I walked with a careful stride, aware of the way the world had rearranged itself around the new truth. At home, the silence was dense. My parents avoided eye contact, and my father's anger burned like a slow fever, sudden at times, and then receding. My mother tried to speak, once, voice fracturing, but I told her I needed time. She left the room then, shoulders shaking, and the absence of her was like a bell tolling a grave I had opened. In the week that followed, consequences rippled through our small orbit. Vendors canceled contracts citing risk and reputational concerns. The venue demanded meetings to discuss refunds and liability. Daniel's business partners started calling with veiled questions. The town council sent an anonymous complaint about the disturbance. Someone I thought a friend messaged to ask if I had considered the fallout for employees who relied on the wedding's income. The pushback was both expected and cruel. The easiest target to hit was the person brave enough to stand up. Tyler insisted we stay the course, that the truth's stickiness would eventually glue things into place. I believed him in my clearer moments, doubting in others. Nights were worst. I lay awake and felt the aftershocks, the missed invites, the splintering of some relationships, the vendors who cursed my name in private because they'd lost money. Vindication costs more than the moment of exposure. My brother, who had been the one to warn me away from public scenes in our youth, called late one night. His voice was low and full of that weary, practical kindness that ran in our family like an old river. He told me he had been at the edge of things, watching, and that he admired my courage even if he disapproved of the means. He confessed he had been tired of the small slights too. He'd seen my parents favor a certain narrative for years, the family story that excluded the parts they found inconvenient. His endorsement was a small gift, a sign that not everyone in the old guard would stand in their corner. He didn't promise to fully take my side in public. He promised to be there for me in private. That still mattered. Private alliances, I was learning, could be more durable than public applause. There were nights when the anger that had pushed me to the steps returned like a tidal assault. I would replay parts of the confrontation, sharpening them in my mind like tools, wondering if I could have been more devastating or kinder. Tyler found me once at the kitchen table with a stack of printouts and a bottle of water untouched at my elbow. We sat in the residue of the fight and talked about the shape of the road ahead. He said something quiet and unavoidable. You'll have to live with their faces in your memory. It was painful to hear, but true. Revenge, even when cleansed with truth, leaves an imprint. We planned then how to move from exposure to repair where repair was possible. There were vendors to contact and apologies to facilitate where the fallout had led to job losses. I didn't want to be the kind of person who cheered as others burned. I wanted accountability, and accountability required an odd blend of bluntness and care. The journalist's piece finally published, and the town's quiet fractured into 1,000 conversations. The article was careful, aimed as much at presenting the facts as at nudging community reflection. Comments poured in, some scathing, some supportive, many curious. A local radio host invited me for a chat. I almost said no. Public speaking felt like stepping onto a stage built of glass. But I agreed because the chance to tell my story in my voice mattered more than my fear. I spoke plainly about the pattern of exclusion, about the slow erosion of confidence that comes from being consistently sidelined. I refused to sensationalize and refused to soften, when softening would mean erasing the hurt. The host asked tough questions about motive and consequence. I answered honestly, and afterward a woman in the studio hugged me, saying she'd been waiting for someone to say aloud the things her family practiced in silence. Not all the heat was public. Inside the family, conversations turned sharp and barbed. My sister-in-law called, voice flat, accusing me of shaming a private moment and causing unnecessary pain. My father demanded a meeting to clear the air, which I read as a request to return to avoidance. My mother brought a box of old photos to the living room like a peace offering, each glossy image a plea for simpler times. I examined them and felt the tug of history, years where kindness had been real but selective. Looking at a picture of myself as a child with my mother smiling beside me, I felt the ache and the love and the betrayal all at once. I could not fake a reconciliation. The photos could not erase the years of exclusion, nor could they excuse the public cruelty. Repair began in small, staggered ways. I reached out to the vendors who had lost deposits, offering to mediate and, where I could, compensate. Some accepted, others refused. I met with the caterer to apologize for the cancellation's damage and offered to connect him with other clients. The gestures were gestures because they had to be. They could not undo the past, but they could indicate a different future. The townspeople watched, some suspicious, others hopeful. I was aware of my image as both avenger and troublemaker, and I understood that a single story rarely fit neatly into a page. Life requires messy stitches. I was learning which seams to pull and which to mend. Months shifted like weather, and the house felt different. My parents retreated into quieter lives. Their invitations dwindled, and the family name's luster dimmed in certain social circles. It was a strange satisfaction to see the balance tip, to know they could no longer hide behind the same facade. But satisfaction was not the same as joy. The house we'd all once shared was full of absent laughter and new silences. Sometimes I sat in the living room and listened for the sound of normal life and found, instead, a hollow that the confrontation had left. Tyler stayed close, patient, and increasingly part of my daily orbit. His steadiness was an anchor I had not expected to need so much. In the quiet hours, as I made plans for work and mended relationships where I could, I understood that revenge's true cost is not only what you make others lose, but what you must be willing to rebuild within yourself. And rebuilding, I learned, is a long, stubborn, necessary labor. The first real winter storm hit our town, just as I thought the noise around the canceled wedding might be fading. Snow coated the sidewalks in uneven sheets, and every breath I took outside felt sharp and metallic. I walked downtown to the coffee shop one morning, my boots crunching against ice, and felt dozens of eyes on me. Some nodded politely, but others turned away, as if the scandal were contagious. Inside, the barista poured my drink with a sympathetic smile and whispered, "Good for you." That tiny phrase kept me warmer than the coffee in my hands. Still, the divide was clear. There were those who quietly applauded me, and those who thought I had ruined everything out of spite. The truth was less dramatic, but no one ever wants truth when a story as juicy as mine can be told in whispers and side glances at the grocery store. At home, the storm outside mirrored the tension within the walls. My father, once a booming presence, moved like a shadow through the house, avoiding me except for the occasional glare. My mother alternated between silent tears and attempts at small talk, as though asking if I wanted dinner could erase the wound. I did not reject her outright, but neither did I accept her attempts. I answered in clipped syllables, and the silence after each exchange was thicker than the snow outside. Daniel had returned to the city with his fiancée, refusing all contact. He sent a single message through a cousin that read, "You've ruined everything for me." Those words burned in my chest longer than I cared to admit. It wasn't guilt I felt, but the ache of a sibling's betrayal, his blind loyalty to a version of family that had never really included me in the first place. Tyler came over often, his presence the only thing that kept me steady. We spent hours at the kitchen table, laptops open, combing through the aftermath like investigators piecing together a case. He reminded me, gently, that my actions had been rooted in a need for dignity, not destruction. But dignity has its own consequences. The vendors I had tried to compensate were split. Some appreciated the gesture. Others posted angry comments online about losing income. Social media became a battlefield I didn't sign up for, my name dragged through digital mud by people I'd never met. Tyler advised me to ignore it, but ignoring felt like letting lies become permanent, so I wrote a long post explaining my side. It wasn't fiery or vengeful. It was a quiet recounting of years of exclusion, ending with a single line. Sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop pretending you're invisible. The post went semi-viral in our small circle. Some people praised my honesty. Others mocked it as attention-seeking. A few old friends messaged privately to admit they had seen the favoritism over the years and regretted not speaking up sooner. That validation mattered more than public approval. It meant I hadn't been imagining it all along. The pain had been real, visible, and simply ignored. Still, the scars deepened. My parents withdrew further, their social life shrinking as invitations dried up. At first, I thought it was justice, but then I saw my mother standing by the window one evening, holding a cup of tea in trembling hands, her reflection pale against the dark glass. For a fleeting second, I pitied her. That pity frightened me, because I didn't want to excuse her cruelty, yet I also couldn't ignore the weight of her collapse. Revenge is complicated when love still lingers beneath the rubble. Weeks later, the attorney contacted me about potential legal ramifications. My father had considered suing me for defamation, claiming I had exaggerated financial details. The threat was real enough to send me spiraling into anxiety. I sat with Tyler in the lawyer's office, my palms sweating as we went through the documents line by line. Thankfully, my careful record-keeping protected me. The attorney shook his head, saying my father's case wouldn't hold in court. That victory should have felt triumphant, but it left me hollow instead. What did it say about our family that we had arrived here on opposite sides of legal counsel? The line between blood and battlefield had blurred beyond recognition. As I walked out of the office, the sky above was gray and unyielding, and I realized there was no going back to who we were before. Meanwhile, Daniel's fiancée made her own move. She reached out through social media with a message dripping in venom, accusing me of jealousy and bitterness. She painted me as a selfish sister, a lonely spinster desperate for attention. I didn't reply, not because her words didn't sting, but because answering her meant stooping to the same pettiness I'd sworn to rise above. Still, the temptation to retaliate burned at the edges of my thoughts. Tyler reminded me, again and again, that silence can be louder than shouting. Let her dig her own grave, he said one night, his hand covering mine. People will see through her eventually. I wanted to believe him, but patience was never my strength. I craved immediate justice, the kind that left no room for doubt. Yet life rarely works that cleanly, and learning to live in the mess was harder than exposing the lie had ever been. The town's curiosity did not wane. Every grocery run became an ordeal of overheard whispers and narrowed eyes. Children who had once waved now stared curiously, tugging at their mother's coats. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a headline, a walking scandal. And yet, in private moments, there were those who confided in me, neighbors who had endured similar favoritism, co-workers who had been overlooked by their families for years. My story gave them permission to acknowledge their own wounds. It was both comforting and exhausting. I hadn't set out to be a symbol, but somehow I had become one. The responsibility weighed on me. I carried their stories like extra baggage, proof that family betrayal wasn't rare, just rarely spoken about. It made me wonder if my decision, as brutal as it was, had cracked open something bigger than my personal revenge. One evening, Tyler and I drove out of town to clear our heads. The snow on the roadside glittered under the headlights, endless and unbroken. We pulled over near a frozen lake, silence stretching between us as our breaths misted the car windows. Tyler finally said what I had avoided admitting. You've changed things forever. Not just for them, for yourself. His words lingered, heavy but true. I stared at the dark water and thought about all the bridges I'd burned. There was no rebuilding them. The ash would never turn back into wood. And maybe that was okay. Maybe survival sometimes meant letting the fire consume everything and learning to live in the new landscape it left behind. The thought was terrifying, but also liberating. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped by my past. By spring, the scandal had dulled into background noise, though its consequences still echoed. Daniel postponed his wedding indefinitely, citing stress and bad timing. My parents stopped hosting dinners. Their circle reduced to a few loyal friends. As for me, I focused on rebuilding, not with them, but with myself. I started therapy, finally admitting that years of exclusion had left me raw and fragile in ways I hadn't acknowledged. My therapist reminded me that revenge doesn't erase pain. It only shifts it. The question, she said, is whether you can carry what's left without letting it define you. I didn't know the answer then, but I knew I had to try. Tyler's unwavering presence helped. His quiet strength filled the spaces my family had hollowed out, teaching me that loyalty doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from choice. And so, Chapter 6 closed with me standing at a strange intersection. Despised by some, respected by others, but undeniably changed. I had pulled the truth into the light, and in doing so, I had set fire to the life I once knew. The ashes were mine to walk through, step by step, as I searched for whatever future waited on the other side. The morning after my confrontation with my mother, I woke to silence, so heavy it felt like a weight pressing on my chest. My phone, always buzzing with messages, remained blank, cold, and empty. No apologies, no explanations, nothing. The house echoed with loneliness, as if every wall carried whispers of betrayal. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink full of dishes, realizing I was still the one left to clean up their mess. But something in me hardened. Their silence wasn't punishment anymore. It was proof. Proof that they had always chosen him over me. Proof that I was never wanted. Proof that my existence in their world was a mistake they never admitted. And with that realization, I promised myself, if they wanted me out of their lives, I would leave, but not before tearing down the illusion of their perfect family forever. That night, I drove past the wedding venue. The lights glittered like stars caught in a glass jar, the kind of magic people spend thousands to rent for a single evening. I parked far enough away that no one would notice me, but close enough to feel the burn in my chest. My brother's name was etched in bold letters across the marquee, a celebration of him. His new life, his future. Not a single trace of me existed there. Not in the plans, not in the pictures, not even in whispers. I clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. If they erased me so cleanly, then I would make sure their grand event, the one they valued more than me, would never be remembered as the happiest day of their lives. It would be remembered as the day everything fell apart. I went home and pulled out an old shoebox from under my bed, the one filled with secrets I had kept locked away for years. Inside were letters, photos, bank statements, pieces of evidence of what my family had done to me, but also what they had done to themselves. My father's unpaid debts, my brother's gambling slips, my mother's angry letters to her own sisters where she confessed her hatred for her marriage. I had kept it all, like little trophies of pain. At first, I thought it was a form of therapy, proof that I wasn't imagining things. But now, looking at them under the harsh yellow light of my room, I saw them for what they truly were, ammo. Ammo I could use to dismantle their facade once and for all. My plan started small, almost delicate. I created an anonymous email and drafted messages to key people, the bride's parents, the wedding planner, even the pastor set to officiate. In each message, I attached copies of those secrets, debt notices, late payments, proof of my brother's hidden gambling addiction. The words I wrote were sharp, precise, and cold, like scalpels slicing through the skin of their carefully curated image. Would you really trust your daughter to marry into a family like this? I wrote to the bride's father. Would you bless this union knowing what they've kept hidden? I attached the evidence and hit send. My hands shook, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was adrenaline. The next day, I sat in a cafe across from the bridal shop where my brother's fiancée was scheduled for her final fitting. Through the window, I watched her arrive, bright and glowing, her mother by her side. She looked like a dream, the kind of woman who thought she was stepping into a fairy tale. But then her phone rang, and I watched as her face shifted from joy to confusion, confusion to horror. She whispered something to her mother, and within minutes, They stormed out of the shop, the dress forgotten on its mannequin. I sipped my coffee slowly, pretending to scroll through my phone, while my heart thundered in triumph. The first crack had appeared in their glass castle. By the end of that week, the wedding planner canceled her services. Rumors began to spread in the small town where we lived, rumors of unpaid bills, of shady dealings, of a family that wasn't as perfect as they wanted everyone to believe. My brother called me, furious, his voice hoarse from shouting, demanding if I had something to do with it. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him doubt, then answered calmly, "Why would I waste my time on you?" The lie rolled off my tongue easily, and he believed me just enough to hang up in frustration. But I knew he suspected, and suspicion was enough to keep him awake at night, wondering just how much I knew and how far I was willing to go. I didn't stop there. At the rehearsal dinner, I slipped in unnoticed, dressed in black, blending into the crowd of servers. No one looked at me twice. While they toasted to love and family, I left little gifts in strategic places. A copy of a bank statement in the bride's purse, a photo of my brother at a casino in the pastor's folder, a crumpled letter from my mother confessing her disappointment in her marriage on the bride's chair. When each person found them, the dinner fell into chaos. Voices rose, accusations flew, and I slipped out quietly, the smile on my face wider than it had been in years. For the first time in my life, I felt powerful. I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the one they mocked or dismissed. I was the storm they never saw coming. I was the shadow in their perfect light, the ghost they thought they had buried but who had risen stronger, fiercer, unstoppable. And as I stood on the edge of their crumbling wedding plans, I knew this was only the beginning. My revenge wasn't just about ruining a single day. It was about making sure they remembered me every time they closed their eyes. I would become the scar they could never hide, the wound that never healed. As I lay in bed that night, the phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was the bride. Her words were simple, almost trembling. "Is it true?" I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keys. Part of me wanted to tell her everything, to expose every lie my family had spun, to let her see me as the savior who had saved her from marrying into a broken family. But another part of me wanted to twist the knife deeper, to let her doubt, let her question, let her spiral into the same confusion I had lived in for years. In the end, I simply typed back, "Ask them." And I turned off my phone. But as sleep crept over me, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge wasn't clean. It wasn't just about their destruction. It was about mine too. Every lie I exposed, every crack I created, pulled me deeper into the darkness I swore I'd never become. And yet, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was the center of their downfall. And I'd be damned if I let them take that away from me. Morning came like a legal summons, bright and unforgiving, while the town hummed with gossip that felt like static at the edge of hearing. I moved through my day as if stitched into a play I no longer understood, hearing whispers stitched to every aisle, every porch, every coffee cup. People who had once smiled past me with expressions that turned quick and cold. The bride's trembling message remained unread on my phone, a small accusation that pulsed like a vein. I told myself the chaos was justice, that truth needed light, but the light was harsher than I had imagined, bleaching faces into caricature. Children pointed without naming names. Older women clucked like broken clocks. Even the barista hesitated when she handed me change, as if the currency had become tainted by association. I moved through the town and felt the eyes of 1,000 spectators. And somewhere beneath the scandal, I realized I was listening for myself and not the town. The meetings at the library and church became displays of public morality, with neighbors trading stories like currency and judges with no robes passing verdicts over coffee. Doors closed when I passed, invitations stopped arriving, and friends who had once called every week now offered awkward nods across lawn fences. It felt as if my life had been reclassified, no longer a sister or a daughter, but an exhibit in an unfolding drama. In town, opinion hardened into categories, those who cheered my bravery and those who demanded mercy for my family. Conversations soured into accusations about motives and method rather than the thing I had tried to expose. Mothers steered their children away, folding collars tighter against contaminated gossip, and men crossed the street with the practiced indifference of people who want no part of messy truth. I learned quickly which faces would never look at me the same way again. Night brought restless thoughts and dreams where faces shifted like cards, revealing new patterns with each shuffle, and the world felt like it could rearrange itself overnight. Tyler called more often now, his voice patient, a tether when the town pulled at me like tides that refused to slacken. He reminded me that I was not defined by the role others insisted upon, and that my life was mine to steer, not a marionette for old family scripts. I wanted his reassurance to be talismanic, to erase the guilt that sat heavy on my chest. But reassurance does not dissolve consequence. I woke to the sound of my own breath, and the image of the ruined venue flashed like a memory, once hopeful, now a shard reflecting everyone's faces. Even the moments of tenderness felt frayed, as if joy had a price, and we had already spent it. My father's reputation, fragile as a paperweight, began to crack in public, an ache I had not foreseen when I set events into motion. Rumors of financial mismanagement and whispers about old mistakes spread like seeds on the wind, finding soil in suspicious minds. Colleagues called to ask questions. Old friends offered vague condolences, and my parents' once steady hands trembled under the weight of whispers. He stared at his phone as if at a verdict. She walked the house at night, hollow-eyed, arranging cups and plates, as if ritual could steady the sinking trust. I had intended to unmask truth, not to bulldoze my family, but truth has a momentum of its own, and does not care where collateral falls. The private anguish in our home widened into a public spectacle, and I watched my actions ripple into corners I had not meant to touch. Legal notices arrived like blunt instruments, letters demanding retractions and apologies, threats of litigation drafted in precise, clinical language that severed emotion from consequence. My inbox filled with angry words typed with legal polish, each line a challenge to my courage and a threat to my stability. I hired an attorney who spoke about defamation and intent in calm professional tones, mapping out risks like landmarks on a road I had already traveled down. She reminded me bluntly that truth as a defense still required demonstration, dates, documents, witnesses. In private, I felt both vindicated and terrified. Vindicated because injustice had been real, terrified because the law cared about lines I had stepped across. The legal world did not reward righteous fury. It measured facts and burdens of proof, and my fury was messy and human. The community split into factions that grew less like groups and more like opposing tides, each pulling at the fabric of daily life until it frayed. Some lauded me as courageous, applauding my unwillingness to let secrets fester. They sent messages of hesitant gratitude. Strangers who had found in me a voice for the small cruelties they had endured. Mothers private messaged thank you notes for saving their daughters from marriages they feared. Others rallied around my brother and parents, defending them with a loyalty that seemed to ignore awkward truths. Loyalty and truth occupied different rooms in the same house, each claiming righteousness. Coffee cliques debated my motives. The high school gossip chain lit up like a minor emergency. My inbox was both shrine and battlefield, full of anonymous praise and quiet threats. I learned to distinguish between the two like a new skill imposed upon me by circumstance. The phone calls changed tone as panic replaced bluster. Where anger once dominated, now there was pleading, then bargaining as people tried to stitch themselves back together. My brother called under the guise of concern, but the tremor in his voice betrayed panic. He wanted information to fix mistakes he had ignored for years. He wanted a map out of rubble he had helped build by omission. He stood at my door one evening, hat in hand, looking every inch the younger man I had once watched fall from his bike, expecting the comfort I could not give. I felt a tenderness that surprised me, a memory of scraped knees and mended shirts, and for a moment I considered handing him a path toward repair. But I remembered too many silences and the reasons they had left scars instead of stitches. A reporter arrived with bright eyes and a recorder hunting for the human face that would sell a headline, and I decided to sit with him, so the story would not be written by rumor alone. I spoke plainly about the little erasures, birthdays forgotten, accomplishments minimized, the slow accumulation of small violences that create a life's architecture, and I did not make excuses for the chaos that followed. The article painted me as complex, neither saint nor villain, thrust into the center of a moral storm. Readers responded with fierce loyalty or ruthless condemnation, and the lines in comment sections hardened into trenches. Even so, something shifted. Conversations that once hid behind humor, now named the quiet harms families can inflict. I felt both exposed and oddly relieved, as if being seen in full had a cost, and a clarity that silence never offered. My brother's collapse was swift, as if guilt and consequence were two sides of a coin that had finally been flipped in the light. His engagement dissolved. His job became tenuous as clients and colleagues recoiled. He walked through his days like someone late to their own life. One night he came to my door, eyes raw, begging for guidance, for a route to make amends. He wanted me to explain everything, to hand him a road map back to honor, a list of steps and apologies that would repair what we had both broken. I saw the man he might have been had we spoken earlier, and a brief tenderness washed over me. I could have opened my arms and told him the whole truth. It would have saved him some agony, but that felt like rescuing a ship by patching it with decisions I no longer trusted. The pastor called for a reconciliation meeting, urging mercy and the slow work of healing, and the town hall filled with people craving a return to normalcy, or at least the illusion of it. My parents sat in the front row, faces pale, a mixture of pride and shame drawn in equal measure. The pastor spoke of forgiveness as a balm, of communities as repair shops for human error. When it was my turn to speak, the room felt less like sanctuary and more like a jury box. I stood and told the truth about being invisible for years, about the way small erasures accumulate until a life feels stolen. I did not celebrate the chaos I had sown. I explained why truth felt like survival. Some nodded with understanding. Others left with their jaws set. The pastor prayed for all of us, both those who had hurt and those who had been hurt, and I learned prayer can be a bridge or a bandage depending on who holds it. In the slow, heavy aftermath, I discovered that vengeance does not wrap things in neat bows, and that doing damage to right or wrong leaves a ledger that balances with its own cruelty. Friendships returned altered. Some doors remained forever closed. My parents grappled with health issues compounded by shame, and my father's pride, once a steel column in our house, now slumped under the weight of public scrutiny. I sat with the knowledge that while my actions had been intentional, they had not been costless. Each night, I held my hands and felt their smallness, feeling the weight of choices and the ache of consequence. Tyler remained beside me, steady and patient, reminding me that survival meant building rather than burning. We walked forward slowly, learning that repair does not undo the past, but offers a way to live with it. The air carried the bite of autumn, the kind that makes leaves crunch underfoot and paints the sky in streaks of orange, but inside me the season felt more like winter. I had spent months watching the consequences of my actions ripple across my family and community, each wave heavier than the last. I walked the streets of our small town as though carrying an invisible weight, shoulders hunched, eyes searching for safety in the faces of strangers. Some gave me nods of approval, subtle acknowledgments that they believed truth was worth the pain. Others looked away, their silence louder than any words, as if acknowledging me would draw scandal into their own homes. I felt caught in the crossfire of two versions of myself, the avenger who had finally spoken out, and the daughter who had shattered her family in ways that could not be undone. Thanksgiving arrived with its smell of turkey and cinnamon, but our family tables sat fractured, chairs empty where laughter once lived. My parents chose to spend the holiday with distant relatives, leaving me and Tyler alone in my apartment with paper plates and whispered prayers. We tried to make it feel festive, but even the glow of candles seemed dimmer under the weight of absence. I scrolled past pictures on social media, each snapshot of smiling families pressing on me like a bruise. I wondered if my brother's fiancée, now long gone, had posted her own dinner with friends, free from the chaos I had ignited. Tyler reached across the table and held my hand, his eyes soft, reminding me that families are not always the ones we are born into. His touch anchored me, but even so, the silence from my parents gnawed at me more than I could admit. In the weeks that followed, the whispers in town began to quiet, replaced by the noise of news scandals and small-town distractions. A teacher caught stealing supplies, a local business shutting down, another marriage unraveling behind closed doors. Yet, even as people moved on, the residue of my choices lingered. I became known less for who I was and more for what I had done, my identity rewritten by gossip and headlines. At work, my colleagues avoided conversations about family, worried they might step on fragile ground. Invitations dwindled, and even casual friendships felt strained, as if people feared catching the contagion of my story. I told myself I didn't care, that solitude was better than false acceptance, but loneliness crept in anyway, filling the empty corners of my apartment like a slow flood. One evening, my mother called for the first time since everything imploded. Her voice was brittle, a mixture of anger and exhaustion, but also something softer I hadn't expected, weariness. She didn't begin with apologies or accusations. Instead, she asked if I was eating, if Tyler was still with me, if I had enough blankets for the winter. The questions were simple, but they carried the weight of years of distance. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why she had never defended me, why her silence had always cut sharper than words. But instead, I answered her questions quietly, feeling both relief and heartbreak wash over me. We ended the call without resolution, but for the first time, I felt the possibility of something less than war between us, even if it was only a fragile ceasefire. My father remained silent, his pride refusing to bend even under the strain of scandal. I heard through neighbors that his health was failing, his hands shaking when he tried to hold tools or cups, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Part of me wanted to rush to him, to offer the care he would never ask for, but another part remembered the years he had dismissed me, diminished me, made me feel like a shadow in my own home. I stood at a distance, torn between compassion and anger, love and betrayal. Tyler encouraged me to reach out, reminding me that regret often weighs heavier than revenge, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. I had given so much already, and I wasn't sure I had anything left to give to a man who had chosen silence over me for most of my life. Christmas came, snow covering the town in a quiet blanket that almost made it look innocent again. The church bells rang with carols, children ran laughing through the streets, and the world seemed determined to celebrate despite everything. Tyler surprised me with a small tree, decorated with mismatched ornaments he had collected from thrift shops. each one carrying its own history. We sat together on the couch, sipping hot chocolate, watching the lights flicker against the window. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe in peace, in the possibility of joy untainted by bitterness. But the truth was never far behind. A card arrived in the mail from my brother, just a single line scrawled in his handwriting. "You destroyed me." I stared at it for hours, wondering if he would ever understand that I had been destroyed long before him, and that my actions had been survival, not cruelty. As the new year dawned, resolutions hung in the air like fragile promises. I decided mine would be to rebuild, not the family I had lost, but the version of myself I had buried under their expectations. I started therapy, sitting in a room with soft chairs and a woman who asked questions I had never let myself answer. She helped me untangle the knot of guilt and rage, to see that my worth had never depended on their approval. It was painful peeling back layers I had spent decades building, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I began to imagine a future that didn't orbit around their rejection or their acceptance. Tyler cheered me on, his patience unshaken, and I realized love could exist without strings, without conditions, without manipulation. It was a revelation that made me cry more than once. By spring, the town had moved on completely, but the scars within my family remained. My parents still avoided me, my father's silence louder than words, my mother's fragile calls too rare to heal old wounds. My brother disappeared into another city, starting over where no one knew his name, leaving behind only bitterness. I accepted that reconciliation might never come, that sometimes families break in ways that cannot be repaired. Instead, I focused on the life I was building with Tyler, small moments of joy, steady love, a home filled with laughter that didn't depend on perfection. I planted flowers in pots by the window, their colors bright against the glass, and told myself this was enough. It had to be enough. Yet even in moments of peace, the past lingered like a ghost. I would wake some nights to dreams of the wedding that never happened, the empty aisle, the ruined dresses, the stunned faces. I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had chosen destruction when silence would have been kinder. But then I remembered all the years I had been excluded, all the times I had been told I was unworthy, invisible, unwanted. Revenge had not brought me happiness, but it had brought me clarity. I would never again let anyone decide my worth. That truth, however messy, was the one gift I carried forward. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I walked it with my head higher than before, determined to write the rest of my story on my own terms. The morning of my 30th birthday began not with celebration, but with silence. No calls, no texts, no reminders from the family I had once bled for. Instead, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against my window and Tyler humming softly in the kitchen. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that made an empty house feel alive. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing that my family's absence no longer hurt the same way. It wasn't numbness, not exactly. It was something heavier but steadier, like acceptance. I didn't need them to validate me anymore. Their silence had once been punishment, but now it felt like freedom. Tyler walked in with a tray, a single candle stuck in a slice of cake, and whispered, "Happy birthday, Aria." For the first time in years, I believed those words could belong to me. Later that day, I walked through town, noticing how the seasons had shifted once again. The trees were budding, life pushing forward, regardless of my personal storms. A few people still glanced at me with the weight of old rumors, but most passed by without recognition, their lives consumed by their own chaos. It struck me that this was the world's way of telling me the story was finished for everyone else, even if I still carried its echoes. That was the nature of pain. It burns bright, then fades into memory for others while remaining sharp for the one who lived it. Yet, as I watched children play on sidewalks and couples share umbrellas against the drizzle, I felt the faintest spark of possibility. Maybe the chapter of vengeance was closed, and the story ahead could be mine alone to write. My mother called again that evening, her voice softer than before. She spoke about the weather, her garden, her aching joints, mundane topics that masked the ocean between us. But then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough, not after years of silence and complicity, but it was something. My throat tightened, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes as I answered, "I know." There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden healing, just a pause filled with words unspoken. We ended the call with a tentative promise to talk again soon. I knew my father's voice would never follow hers, that his pride would keep him shackled to resentment. But hearing my mother's apology cracked open a door I thought was sealed forever. Spring stretched into summer, and with it came opportunities one hadn't imagined. I was offered a promotion at work, a chance to lead a project that aligned with my passion rather than simply paying the bills. For years, I had believed success was something I had to earn to prove my worth to my family. Now, I chased it for myself, not for their approval. Standing in the office conference room, presenting my ideas with confidence, I realized how far I had come. My colleagues no longer looked at me with pity or caution. They saw me as capable, someone who had survived fire and come out forged stronger. It wasn't revenge that defined me anymore. It was resilience. And that was a legacy my family could never take from me. On quiet nights, Tyler and I would sit on the porch, the hum of cicadas filling the warm air. He'd tease me about my stubbornness, I'd laugh at his corny jokes, and together we built something steady. Love wasn't always grand gestures or fireworks. It was constancy, presence, a hand to hold when the world turned cruel. I thought often about the family I had lost, but I realized I had gained something more valuable, a partner who saw me fully and never asked me to shrink. Revenge had once been the fire that fueled me, but love became the foundation that steadied me. It was a trade I'd make 1,000 times over, even with all the scars. Still, the past lingered in subtle ways. Walking past the old church where the wedding should have been, I felt ghosts in the stained glass windows. The memory of that day, the ruined flowers, the silence that followed, clung to me like a shadow. I wondered if my brother still hated me, if he told people the story of how I destroyed his wedding like some villain out of a cautionary tale. But then I reminded myself, his hatred was not mine to carry. I had told my truth, taken my stand, and borne the cost. Whether he ever forgave me or not, I refused to let his narrative become my prison. My story was no longer about destruction. It was about survival. Months later, I found myself speaking at a local community center, sharing pieces of my journey with others who had been estranged from their families. I saw reflections of my own pain in their eyes, but also sparks of recognition, even hope, as I spoke about reclaiming identity, about finding worth outside of blood ties. I realized my story could serve as more than tragedy. It could be a map for others, a reminder that you don't need the validation of those who reject you to build a life of meaning. The applause that followed wasn't just approval, it was communion. For once, I felt understood in a way my family had never given me. One autumn morning, I visited my parents' house, unannounced. The porch creaked the same way it had when I was a child, the smell of pine still clinging to the yard. My mother opened the door, eyes wide with surprise, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she stepped aside, letting me in. The living room was familiar yet strange, photographs of my brother and his new life scattered across the walls, but none of me. I sat with her, drank lukewarm coffee, and for the first time, we talked without pretense. She admitted her failures. I confessed my bitterness. And though we didn't fix everything, we planted a seed of understanding. My father never joined us, his footsteps echoing upstairs. But that day, I chose to leave without anger. Some bridges will always burn, but others can be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, plank by plank. Looking back, I saw that revenge had cost me dearly, but it had also freed me. I had lost a family that never truly saw me, but in that loss, I found myself. I built a life grounded not in their approval, but in my own strength and the love I allowed in. There were scars, yes, some days sharper than others, but there was also peace. And peace, I realized, is far more powerful than vengeance. My journey wasn't clean or easy, but it was mine, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Standing at the edge of the same river, where I once dreamed of escape, I whispered to the water, I made it. The current carried my words away, but I knew the truth would always remain within me. And so here I am, sharing this story with you, not as someone who won every battle, but as someone who survived them. If you've ever felt betrayed, unseen, or cast aside by those who should have loved you most, know this. Your worth is not defined by their blindness. You can rise, rebuild, and reclaim your story on your own terms. My path was messy, brutal, and filled with mistakes, but it led me here, to freedom, to love, to peace. And if my story touched you, if it made you feel less alone, then I ask only this, like, share, and subscribe, so we can keep building a community where broken pieces become mosaics and pain transforms into power. Your support keeps these stories alive, and together, we'll continue writing endings worth remembering.